Now, it does me great pleasure to be able to provide a formal introduction to today's guest co-host, Omari Aarons. And I want to take a moment to just provide his bio so that you all are aware of why we found it very appropriate to extend an invite for Omari to be a part of today's conversation. Omari Jahi Aarons has worked with Fortune 150 companies his entire career as a disruptive leader and transformation coach. Often, Omari has built infrastructures to support culture change efforts and originate roles at Apple, Macy's, and Liberty Mutual Insurance. In 2019, Omari founded the Aarons Group LLC, a diversity and inclusion workplace consulting firm. A strong champion of inclusion, Omari completed a year-long fellowship in the YW Boston's Lead Boston 2020 cohort, an inclusive leadership program. Omari joined the board of directors for Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Eastern Massachusetts in September 2020. He is a licensed minister and director of social justice action at the historic Charles Street AME Church in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood. Insurance Business America honored Omari with their inaugural Leader of Change Award in September of 2020 and the Rising Star Award in October of the same year. Omari was selected by the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce as a 2020 10 Outstanding Young Leaders and as a 2021 40 LGBTQ Leaders Under 40 for North America by Business Equality magazine. Omari earned a Bachelor of Arts from Xavier University and is currently a Howard Thurman Fellow and Master of Divinity candidate at Boston University School of Theology. And so help me, all of you who have joined here today in your own way through the chat, to welcome our guest co-host Omari to the conversation. We always say at NWC, we never take it lightly. When someone says yes to our invite, we know they could be spending that time doing so many other things, but Omari, you said yes, and we are so grateful. And we want to just give you an opportunity to greet this audience in your own way. We've read your bio, we know some of your accolades and your credentials, but what can you tell this audience that maybe we would not find in your bio that helps us to understand how you show up to this conversation and the lens that you bring to this conversation? Welcome, Omari.
Thank you so much, Nika. It's such an honor to join you and to join your team and to be part of this conversation today. I'm really excited to be here. What's kind of interesting even about your opening question for me is that in divinity school at Boston University School of Theology, one of the things that we're constantly talking about is, what is your lens that you bring to the conversation? What's the social context, your social location that you bring? And so, I find it important in my work to always name that African-American man who grew up in Washington, D.C., member of the LGBTQ community, a minister, a proud middle son, proud uncle, to a crew of adoring nieces. I was talking to my grandmother yesterday just about life and kind of catching up on things. And she was sharing something she said to us a number of times, that each generation is supposed to do better than the next generation. And she's very proud of her children and very proud of her grandchildren. And so it was just wonderful to hear that again from her yesterday as well, that really our work and what we are about as human beings is trying to make this world really better for generations that come after us. So happy to be doing my part there.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. We're happy that you're doing your part too, and that you're here sharing with us. And so I want to jump right in and talk a little bit about your history, your work experience, and bring all of those different elements into today's conversation. So first, tell us a little bit more about your consulting firm. I mean, obviously, we've heard through the opening that is in the same space, diversity and inclusion, but I'm also of the persuasion that not every DEI consultancy operates the same way. And so what would you say is something that is part of what makes you unique and your company unique in terms of maybe your approach and the lens that you align with how in which you like to partner with clients?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a belief that I share. And, someone said to me not too long ago, they're like, seems like everybody's a DEI consultant these days, right? Like,
yes.
And I said, there's so much work that needs to be done.
Yes.
And I said, so, we need even more people than we have today, in this field. I would say my lens really, I grew up really in the human resources space, thinking about what people need and want, and how do you connect the organization's strategy and policies and programs to really meet what is the urgent demand of the moment. And so I internally through the organizations that I've worked for, have primarily done that as an employee resource group leader, have done that managing employee engagement survey data and the response to it and developing plans, have done that as an ambassador for our foundation and some of our diversity inclusion initiatives. And so a lot of that work really served as the foundation for starting the Aarons Group. And I would say my specialty there is really around voice of employee. How do we amplify the voices of people inside of our organization, particularly when you look at data and so often the historically underrepresented, underpowered groups within an organization are just a small fraction, right? And so when you ask these questions around, are you having a good experience at work? Do you have a best friend at work? Is your manager supportive of you? We look at that survey data and everyone's cheering the fact that 91% of people, say yes, or 85% of people say yes. And it's like, yes, that's a great thing. When you start to look at people who would likely consider themselves diverse and how they respond to those surveys, you see a different perspective on organizations, right? And that's really where the opportunity lives. So I find my work both as a direct consultant and then also as a tier 2 consultant, really to be around voice of employee and capturing sentiment, understanding people's lived experience, and really working with organizations on how to make that better.
No, I love that, Omari. And something you said really resonated with me. And it's about the necessity of just aggregating the data to see what the responses are based upon different identities and populations. And usually the story that's being told once you break that out is vastly different, right? And that's where I think we get some really useful information to be able to understand that you can have two truths of experience side by side that are vastly different for different types of people in the organization. So I love that you brought that to the conversation. And you've talked a lot about the HR lens that you bring. And so, there's some folks here that are part of the HR space, and that's also how in which they show up into this broader work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And obviously, there's great level of connectivity there. I wonder if you have been a part of conversations, because I know that I have, where people have questioned and really tried to understand, where should this work reside? Should it be within HR? Should it be completely separate? And what usually is the response that you have for that?
Yeah, I tend to think of it as you have to really look at your organization's infrastructure and what's your organization ready for, right? I think, whether you have your chief HR officer reporting directly to your CEO, or if they're reporting to your chief HR officer, and either way, that person has to be a direct counselor to both and to all of your senior business leaders, right? Like that person has to have the access to say, I need 5 minutes from you today. And to have the power to be on the calendar, to have regular standing meetings. Some organizations are so large and so much of the work around diversity, equity, inclusion inside of workplaces is around HR policies, is around manager expectations, is around what happens when our values are not applied correctly in a particular situation. And so, the strong connection with HR makes sense. The thing that I worry about, and I talk to organizations about, is that your DEI work does not sit exclusively in the human resources space, right? So certainly talent, recruitment, like all these things. But how do you also ensure, if your diversity and inclusion officer does not report directly to the CEO and reports into HR, that person also has access to business leaders? So as you're thinking about products, as you're thinking about marketing, the communities that you're targeting, right? As you think about in your foundation work, money that you're giving away, organizations that you're sponsoring, nonprofits you're working with, that lens really has to be applied in every aspect of the business and the work that you're doing. And so really it has to be, if it's not on paper, the direct line, In some ways, it's got to be a very strong dotted line relationship directly to the CEO or to the chief officer of that organization, so that that person really can help to embed that lens throughout. It's such an interesting role, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where it's like, in some ways, diversity and inclusion is everyone's responsibility, right?
Everyone's, yes.
At the company, right? And so even though you have a person who has the title and they're really leading the strategy and serving as a counselor, there's a piece of it that has to live in everyone's job description, that has to be part of what everyone is doing in the organization.
I agree. We all have to own it. And I think that's such an important message. I find that there are a lot of people who, at their core, when you were to engage them, it's clear that they value diversity, equity, and inclusion. They see it as important, but they're passive, and that they see it as the responsibility of someone else. And typically, the someone else is a person maybe that carries the title of chief diversity officer, manager, director, or even like your HR professionals, right? And I think the opportunity for each of us is to recognize that this is a leadership competency and function, not by position or title necessarily, but by influence. And we can lead and influence people from any place within the organization. So with that mindset, I think that causes us to own the work and the responsibility, hold ourselves accountable, model it, and then also be able to hold others accountable. So you and I share a likeness of the understanding that diversity, equity, and inclusion belongs to all of us. It needs to be fully operationalized. And yes, the HR piece is critically important, but as you mentioned, corporate social responsibility, your marketing communications, even as it relates to your procurement, your supplier diversity, what vendors are you putting in your consideration set? So we're definitely aligned. I have to share, Omari, that you're getting some love for your bow tie from some of our colleagues that are in the from the chat. So yes, loving the bow tie, I do agree. It's really sharp. And I want to just take this opportunity to, for our audience, again, if you're just joining the conversation, feel free to use the chat to create a sense of community. If myself or Omari is saying something that resonates with you, place it into the chat. If you have a question, we're going to get to questions soon. Place it into the chat in case you don't want to forget that. And feel free. You don't have to turn your cameras on, but we certainly welcome seeing your smiling faces if that's something that you're comfortable with. And so I just wanted to take a moment to share that. Now, I want to move to going back and traveling in time. I realize that we're at a point now to where people's comfort level with socializing now in larger groups and environments is definitely evolving, because people have been vaccinated, for those who have gotten the vaccine. And so I think that's creating a greater level of comfort for people. But let's travel back for a moment to the start of COVID, when the pandemic first hit. Let's think about what was happening then. And so I want to just get your reactions from where you were then to what you're seeing now, and how it has impacted so many different people and organizations, and how you're feeling hopeful about time to come.
Yeah, what's really interesting is when I go back and I map out 2020, I generally think about COVID really kind of taking over our way of life really in March. But when you go back and you look at it, it really started in February. You had these kind of spikes that were going up. People weren't sure, quite what was happening. And then really in March is when kind of everything started shutting down. The other thing that's kind of interesting around that same time frame is February is actually when Ahmaud Arbery was killed in Georgia, and we didn't learn about it until March, April timeframe when the videotape came out, right? But that's actually when it happened. So it really kind of started. It was the start of kind of really twin pandemics for us for the year. And we didn't know it yet at that point. And then as it progressed, very early on in COVID, one of the things that was happening was there's the first of the recent waves of anti-Asian violence, right? And so you had people, we even had a U.S. president calling it the Chinese flu, and all of these things. And so there were these outward acts of discrimination, microaggressions and macroaggressions that were happening against our Asian American colleagues and friends and family members. And so there was what I thought was a beautiful moment in March, right as we were all trying to figure out what was happening, where there were a number of statements that were issued really across the perspective from Black and Hispanic-led organizations to say this is not okay, right? As communities who also frequently experience this type of violence and discrimination and aggression, we're standing in solidarity with our Asian brothers and sisters. And so that was a beautiful moment. And of course, led right into Breonna Taylor and the videotape of Ahmaud Arbery. And then, we got to George Floyd at the end of May in June. And, the world really just kind of blew up. The thing that I say about that for people is, from my experience, there was kind of two answers that people would give, right? So something would happen, and you had a Trayvon Martin or a Sandra Bland, and right, some other incident, and there was almost like a code word clearance, right, for being inside. I would see another person of color in the hallway who I knew would know, what was going on. I could see it in their face. They were thinking and feeling the same way, going, oh, here we go again, right? Yet another one. When is it going to stop? And at the same time, I'd walk past another colleague and they go, hey, how was your weekend? Right. And, and so you just go, do I want to have a whole deep education moment right now? Like I'm just walking to the cafeteria to get coffee in the morning. Like
Yes.
I'm not really trying to do all of that. Right. So it was like people who knew were very much on the inside of these experiences and how they would go. And then people who weren't in the know just didn't know, right? It was kind of moving obliviously through their lives. But for several of us, George Floyd happened, and it wasn't new or novel or different for any of us. It was tapping into this pain that was really this wound that is always open and never really allowed to heal. And so that was happening. So the hope that moment gave me was, it was like, finally, it's being acknowledged in this bigger way. And people were asking, they were curious, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Right. And pushing past that initial answer of fine, I'm fine, I'm making it, but really wanting to talk, which was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. And so, I think about that as a moment that I try to hold on to, particularly in this work. The other side of that for me was just our CEO had encouraged people to reach out, check in on your Black colleagues and see how they were doing. And so my inbox was flooded. It took me like 2 weeks to respond to everyone's message and instant message and text and all of that, right? I finally got everything cleared out. And then Rayshard Brooks was killed in Atlanta that weekend that I had finally kind of cleared everything out. And I said, oh gosh, all right, here we go. Going into work on Monday, right? I had 0 messages, right? I was like, where is the flood, right? Like what happened? Last week we were all in tune and making these commitments, and I stand with you and I'm praying for you and all of that, and it just disappeared overnight. So there, that temporal nature of these things happening, it was like there was a moment everyone paid attention, and then very early on felt like we took our eye off the ball so quickly. But then raising that up, right, to your question on what's the hope, raising that up for people go, oh gosh, yeah, I did. Like, how did I miss that one, right? I had been paying attention to the news coverage and what was happening with George Floyd and the officers being released and then arrested and then released and all of these things. How did I miss Rayshard Brooks? How did I miss Jacob Blake? How did I, these other incidents that happened in that same time period? So it just reminds me that we have to, no pun intended, but we have to be intentional about the conversations that we're having and the work that we're doing. We have to be intentional about our focus and what we're paying attention to.
Absolutely. And what a place of privilege it is to have all of these complex issues to occur. And because you aren't impacted, it doesn't even find its way into your conversation, as you were talking and giving the analogy of as people of color, Black people were passing each other in the hallways, so even without saying a word, they were communicating around, I stand with you, I feel what you feel, and yeah, I'm hoping we both get out of this. And then you had others, hey, how was your weekend? Totally oblivious, and it just reminds us of privilege is often invisible to people who have it. They don't necessarily even have to think about the implications of not having the weight of certain circumstances to cause you to feel uncertain about your safety, your health, your quality of life from an opportunities perspective, and the list goes on and on. I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe it as twin pandemics, and so that language caught me when you said that. But yes, you're right. We had two very significant social complex issues happening at once that were overwhelming, independently, and then combined, it was a big ball of mess, that all of us were having to process and navigate. And it was hard. It was so hard. And so, yeah, I always like to ask the question about hope, because I think that when we're in the midst of it, it feels so heavy, and it feels like, how are we going to come out of this? And yet, and still, I'm not saying that we're out of it by any means at all, but I am glad that people are finding pockets of hope and certainty about us all kind of emerging strong, because if we don't have that, then what's left, right? We will feel defeated before even trying to take another step to try. So we have to make sure that we're finding that sense of hope and letting that guide us towards continuing to be in the fight in whatever way that looks like. So,
well, Nika, I say this about hope as well, right? Because we lean on hope naturally as our human tendency, in a way where we think about hope when it's optimistic, right? Like I hope things will get better. The preponderance of data in this area, as we look at the 400 years of history in the US, strongly indicates that there's no optimism, right? Like if you follow the data trends and you really are in it, there's no optimism in it. And so how do you still have hope? Hope is this notion that we're persisting, we're going to work toward it anyway, even if it may not happen in our lifetime, right? It may not happen for me to make it better. Similar to what my grandmother said to me yesterday, right? We're doing this work for the generation that comes after us with the hope that they're not going to have to do this work, right? That it won't have to be as intense for them. So it gets really interesting, my relationship with hope. And of course, as a minister, I believe very strongly in hope, and I believe very strongly in optimism. And at the same time, I have to confront the reality that, in this work, if we look at the data tells us that we shouldn't be optimistic. What's interesting about that is I think we're seeing some new data trends as a result of kind of this George Floyd moment that happened for our society, that is starting for me to connect optimism back to hope for this experience, for this work, and for the world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Great comments. And I'm seeing there's some good chatter happening into the chat. So thank you all for using that as a tool for community. I want to amplify something that Melissa has posted. Melissa Davis, thank you for your commentary. But she says, it seems these murders happen so often that to reach out to our BIPOC friends and colleagues would mean we're sending an "I'm thinking of you and my prayers are with you" would be a daily text or email. And it starts to feel like those sentiments are simply not enough. The grief surrounding the police killings of Black men and women is overwhelming. And I can appreciate that statement. Sometimes I think that our white colleagues and allies and friends and associates, maybe they hesitate because they do grapple with, is this going to make a difference? Just to be able to say, hey, I'm thinking about you, I'm standing in solidarity with you, especially when it feels like that's a everyday occurrence, And so I can appreciate the story that you shared where, the next incident you walked in and there was nothing. The floodgates did not open for you in that situation. You didn't have all those emails of support. And I've heard a lot of well-intended white colleagues to say, I just don't know what to say and what to do. And I don't want to add more trauma and more harm to what people are experiencing in that moment. So I get the complexity of it. I really do. And I appreciate, Melissa, you being vulnerable to share that perspective and that thought that probably so many are holding in their minds. Any comments you have to that, Omari?
Yeah, what's kind of interesting. Had shared with you all at the beginning. I'm working as a chaplain this summer, right, in a public service hospital, and so having a lot of encounters with grief, and so much of it is I don't know what to say. Right, there's not anything necessarily that I can say that's going to take the pain away. that's necessarily going to make you feel better in the moment. There's not going to be some magic words or, even a prayer lifted or some blessing
Yeah.
that's offered. And so sometimes my words are, I don't know what to say, but I'm
Yeah.
here, right?
Yeah.
I'm standing here in this room. I will hold your hand. I will just sit with you if that's what you need. I semi-jokingly would say some of these days make me go home, lay on my floor and stare at the ceiling, right? And so
Yeah.
sometimes I just need someone to say, I'm gonna lay on the floor and stare at the ceiling with you, because that's all we can do in this moment. Um, and then I will also be here to say, all right, it's a new day. You got to get up because the work still needs you, right? Tomorrow needs you just as much as today did. So,
Mhm.
go have your moment, get your rest, try to process as best you can, but you got to get up, you got to keep going.
Yeah.
So I absolutely think there's such great value in saying, I don't know what to say.
I think so too.
And that's okay. And
That's
that's okay. And
okay.
know that that's a good response
It
as
is. It
well.
is. I'm so
Yeah.
glad you amplified that. And I think what it does is it gives other people permission who also don't know what to say to realize that I don't have to have this perfect, right? I don't have to have this perfect. I'm not being asked or expected to fix something in and of myself immediately in this moment. And so
Yes.
I appreciate you bringing that to the fore. And I think there's a lot of, I mean, grief is what so many people were experiencing, And so I'm glad that you kind of brought that analogy into the conversation, because it was, whether or not we all knew all of those individuals that we've named at the top of the hour who lost their lives unnecessarily. Many of us didn't know those individuals personally, but we still were grieving because we were so impacted deeply. And so I love what you're bringing to this conversation. I really appreciate it. Diana has a question now that I want to present. And her question is, how can we navigate life while we hear the attacks, murders of people of our race, and we have children that are adults and working and walking out there in danger? Yeah, I'm a mom,
Ooh.
so I feel that. Yeah.
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 It's when I moved to Boston, I'm originally from Washington, D.C. And, the thing that my parents were really nervous about is, I'm in this city. When I first
Yeah.
moved here, didn't have any friends here, didn't have any family here. Right. And, and so the thought that I think when most of the time someone gets a new job and they're moving to a new city, and it's very exciting, right? You're going, hopefully you're making some more money for this transition, and higher level responsibility, good career progression, like all of that. The thing that was weighing on my parents was who's going to tell us if something happens to you, right? Like, how long will it be before the people at your new job would know that you go missing, right? And then would start to activate and do some things. Where when I was in Cincinnati, I had gone to undergrad there. I had friends in the area. My best friend lived 10 minutes away, had a key to my house, right? Like all of that. There was a huge support system for me in Southwestern Ohio, of people who would be able to show up, right, if something
Yeah.
happened, within like a couple of minutes, somebody would be there. And it was like, what happens if you're pulled over in Boston and you don't make it out of that experience? Like, who's doing it? So there's this real fear, when I'm driving home and I'm talking to my mom on the phone, and I'm like, okay, I'm getting off the highway exit, so I'm only 10 minutes from home. She's like, oh, all right, well, call me when you get home. And I'm like, no, I'm only 10 minutes. Like, I can see my, condo building, right? Like, it's like, and it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
after you park and you
Yeah.
get upstairs and you are
Right.
inside, right? Like, just call me so I know that you made it, So
Yeah.
it's a very real fear. And I think, it's something you learn to live with, unfortunately, right? It's unfortunate that we have to do that, but you have to keep living. And there's a way in which, I strongly believe there are things that we're supposed to be afraid of. And fear helps to keep us alive.
That's a good
And
point.
so, but you can't allow fear to be the all-consuming thing for you
Right.
all the time,
Right.
right? So, because
Right.
otherwise you won't ever get to experience any of the other emotions. You don't get joy, you
Yeah.
don't get triumph, you don't get, happiness and satisfaction and contentment, and so you need those as well. But it's okay to have the fear. At times fear can be really healthy for us as long as you don't live there, right? But there
Yeah.
is so much that happens in our world, right? And not even just in you know, police brutality, or kind of these injustices that result in loss of life. If you live in fear, you could really be afraid of everything, right?
Of
And
course.
so it's trying to find that balance of, I worry about you because I care about you and I love
Right.
you,
Right.
right? And I want you to have life, liberty, and happiness, right? As
Mhm.
Thomas Jefferson endowed us with. Um, and then also recognizing the reality that, you know, there are some things that make life a little bit more dangerous for some people than others.
Right. Well stated. Yeah, I have to share that I am one of those moms too. Yeah, I want to know where you are every second. And that has amplified for me because of what we're experiencing. And so it's a hard place to be, but again, we can't let fear consume us. So
Yeah.
Anya Patterson has something very interesting into the chat. And while I'm happy to read this, I also want to extend an opportunity to Anya, if you're willing to maybe unmute yourself and share directly. If not, I'm happy to present your question, because I think it's one that probably many of us in this community are grappling with.
Mm.
I'll give
Sure,
it
I'm
just a
happy to,
second. Okay, great. Go for
yeah,
it.
I'm happy to like read it out loud. And
Sure.
so what I wrote was that I found that I'm having like this increased difficulty not being frustrated by like the white people around me, specifically whether they're my colleagues or like those that I consider friends, when they share like, I'm so overwhelmed with like grief and sadness, like I'm taking time off, I'm doing all these things, right? As they're like overwhelmed, of course, by like the violence that's being inflicted on Black bodies. So I'm like, what are some tools and tips that you can share, if any, on how to process my own grief as a Black woman and still engage with them in a meaningful manner? Because I found that I'm just like so frustrated. I'm like, you want me to hold your grief and mine? Like, how is it that you are able to process this more than I am? Like, it's just so frustrating. So if you have
Yeah.
any tips, that would
Yeah.
be very helpful.
Yeah, you know, the thing I'd say about that, and I so appreciate that perspective, because I do, it's something I think all of us are living into to varying degrees. Um, you know, what I think about is that I'm 36 years old, and so I've been Black for 36 years, and I have been responding to and experiencing microaggressions, macroaggressions, violence at times, racism, right? The effects of all of that, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally. You know, so I have 36 years in the game, of experiencing that. Maybe I'll say 30 years, right? Of like around consciousness and all. And I think as part of that, you know, I've developed kind of my coping mechanisms. You developed your coping mechanisms, the way that you process, you know. And so it's like, whether, you know, for some people it's prayer, for some people it's tequila, for some people it's working out, right? Like whatever your thing is, or your several things. I have kind of all three of those. And so, you know, you've kind of developed your own system. What we heard a lot of in the George Floyd moment in particular was people saying, I had no idea. And, you know, they're processing several things, right? There's a little bit of guilt for the privilege of, um, you know, not having any idea, right? There's a reason you didn't have an idea. There's a reason that this wasn't on your radar. And so, you know, that part is present. There's a feeling of helplessness and inadequacy that also shows up there, right? Of, I can't fix this for you, right? So many people said to me, if I could just, you know, write a check, if I could go and do some volunteer hours on Saturday from 9 to 5, right? And this thing would be done, it'd be easy. The thing that's really hard about this work is that it's a constant pursuit of almost. Yeah, this is not anything that we ever get to check off our list. We're never done with this work. And it's always changing. You know, I'm hyper aware, particularly in Pride Month, that the LGBTQ plus, right, like has several other letters in it, because those letters continue to evolve as people's understanding of their own identity continue to evolve as well, right? So we're always learning. No one has a lock on it. There's no one that's like, I am like the consummate, you know, master learner, teacher of like all things diversity, equity, inclusion. We all get it wrong at times. We all make missteps, you know, at times. And so, you know, you just have more experience in processing. You know, if you could write a check, if you could do service hours on a Saturday and fix it, like, you know, you would have, right? Like I certainly would have. And so we're better used to processing it. So, you know, the thing is, I would say here about self-care is being able to express to people, listen, I appreciate that you are in this moment and you are feeling it. I'm feeling it really heavy too right now. And the way that I'm processing is I'm taking some space to be able to do that. Perhaps maybe next week we could have a conversation as you continue to process. And I always tell people, Google is your friend, right? Like hit that
Yeah.
Google and look up, you know, I'm feeling grief, like how, you know, strategies to respond to grief and handle it and comfort for yourself. And there are some wonderful meditations out there. There's wonderful essays, research, scholarly articles as well on how to do it. So people can self-resource without necessarily leaning on you. And I find sometimes when our emotions gear up in this way, we get hijacked, right? And so all the things that we would normally do when we were trying to solve any other problem kind of fade away for us into the background. And so you can always say in that conversation as your go-to, there are some really good articles on Google I would recommend that you look at. You should read them over this next week, right? And that will help you while I'm taking space and you're taking space too.
No, I love that. Resources abound right now. I've said that several times. And so I think that's one of the low-hanging fruit opportunities that all of us can lean into and take advantage of to help us minimize maybe some of the trauma that people of color could experience, while other well-intended white colleagues and friends and associates really want to try to stand in solidarity. And it's okay. We have to know that it's okay to say, I appreciate your gesture. I know that you're there. I need space right now. And we have to make sure that we're okay letting people know how to best support us. And the people on the receiving end of that message need to be okay and not take offense to, they need time. They need time. What you've done is a great gesture, but time is the best way to support right now. Letting them know that you're there, but you know, and I think that's okay, because sometimes I think we feel compelled to try to receive that level of support the way in which it's being given out, and maybe that's not the best way to support you in that moment. So there's vulnerability on both sides. And, you know, we've talked a lot about creating these brave spaces. We have to be brave to name what we need. And we also have to be willing to, on the receiving end, once we hear that, now how are we going to process this and what are we going to do with it? You know, extend grace and accept grace is often what I like to say. So these words you stated, and they really resonated with me. Constant pursuit of almost. Yeah. I really like that, constant pursuit of almost. And that is precisely how I know I have felt on many occasions, where we'll get through something and I'm like, we're not going to let this kind of define us. This is going to make us stronger. And then right around the corner, something else hits. You know, so you feel like we're almost getting there or we're making progress. And then it's like, whoa, are we really making progress? So constant pursuit of almost really resonated with me.
I will give full credit. It came from a TED Talk, and I feel so bad I'm blanking on her name, Sarah. But the TED Talk title is The Art of the Near Win.
Okay.
And yeah, so I don't know if someone can Google that and see what pops up, but it's
I feel like my team is probably trying to source it right now. That'll be great. Because I think I saw you share this on your LinkedIn. Yes, it's already out there.
Yeah.
There you go,
Thank you, Abella. Yeah. And she does a wonderful job just in there talking about how, you know, in this type A culture of hyper productivity, right? Like we want to cross the things off on our list. Like we feel accomplished in doing that, but there are some things that really require you know, you're really apprenticing in them for your entire life. And this is a space that's one of them. It's because we never become the full experts of everything, right? Just as we were talking about. So why there's so many DEI consultants, it's because there's somebody who is adding who's adding perspectives to all the different dimensions of diversity that we all carry, and it's all beautiful.
Yeah, you know,
I highly recommend that TED Talk.
I love it. Well, it's in the chat, and I do recommend. I'm going to take a listen to it myself. I have not, but I do remember you talking about it. And I'm glad that it came up in this conversation as well. So you reminded me of something, and then I want to shift because I want to talk about Pride Month. But I am starting to experience and become keenly aware that there is an expectation of even practitioners and owners and founders of these DEI, companies, to where maybe there is this unrealistic expectation that even those organizations are going to be free from some of the DEI challenges that sometimes find its way into our clients' environments that we are helping to coach and walk them through. And the bottom line is that
Yeah,
this is hard work. It shows up in so many different places. Yes, we continue to exercise rigor and due diligence to try to minimize it, but yeah, even practitioners, we're learning ourselves. We're navigating the complexities as well. And so,
absolutely.
yeah, you bringing that to the conversation really resonated with me, and I thank you for that. So here's a question for the entire group, and I want you to verbalize your
Yeah.
response. But I want to understand what have you seen, and even those who are joined here today, in terms of examples of organizations who have been successful in their commitments made a year ago. We just recognized the anniversary of George Floyd's murder on May 25th, and many organizations were finding ways to really just come and reflect on that moment and the legacy of his life, including NWC. And it was very meaningful time that was had. But what are you seeing in terms of what you heard at that time when everyone was sounding the alarm and they had this heightened appetite to want to get into the fight, if you will? What are you seeing from then to now that, and I don't want to even put it in a position of that's positive or negative, just what are you seeing? And I also invite the audience to share some thoughts as well into the chat.
Yeah, yeah. I certainly would love if anyone is working for a company or an organization that they would say, we're doing really well on the plan. That was announced
Yeah.
last year. I'd love to see it. I say two organizations in particular. So just from a framing standpoint, a couple of key things that like everybody included in their work. A lot of corporate donations were made to Black Lives Matter, to NAACP, to historically Black colleges and universities last year. And I thought all of that was wonderful, and it'll be interesting to see if those anniversaries and campaigns are anniversary this year. If people will continue to do them. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I want to see the other $1 million donations that are going out to these organizations. Lot of training on bias, conscious and unconscious, on microaggressions, allyship, anti-racism, kind of all the buzzwords of the moment. I'd love to see kind of next level trainings that continue to happen for people. Just like, Terry, the EDI certificate programs offered by so many organizations as well. Really, really great. And then particularly on the pipeline piece, it was thinking about executives in organizations, people with P&L responsibility, making sure that there were people of color in those pipelines. We were looking at promotions. We were starting to look around and see what level people were in our organizations, how long they had been sitting at that level, right? And we saw some stories that just didn't make sense, that it's like, well, that person did this, but then that person, well, I wonder what's different, right? Two organizations I think that have done just an awesome job, and I'm happy talking about them because right now I'm not consulting for either of them, and I haven't been an employee for either as well. JP Morgan Chase, their Advancing Black Pathways program, which was something they had actually started. That wasn't a George Floyd initiated program. It was something they had been doing. And it really was this all-encompassing strategy of their entire business. So on the talent standpoint, it was internships, kind of post-college manager rotational type programs, targeting specifically students of color that were coming into the workforce to provide those experiences. There was also home buying workshops, looking at not just the classes for the process, but also looking at their loans and making more money available, thinking about interest rates, things like that, from that perspective. More education on financial literacy. They also did, which I thought was really cool, last year, a lot of people missed graduations. and they did an
Yeah.
HBCU graduation, and President Obama was
Yeah.
the kind
I
of their
remember
keynote
that.
speaker. Was
Yeah.
just so cool, right? So just that overall continuing initiative for them,
Mm,
and they had already gone far, but when the George Floyd moment happened, they really challenged themselves and said, can we do even more than we had previously
yeah.
committed to? And so they did. So I'm a huge fan. I'm a happy customer as well of JP Morgan Chase. So if they want to, put some money on my credit card bill for saying that, I'd appreciate that too. The other one I'd say is PwC. And
Mhm.
what PwC did is they were kind of one of the founding companies of the CEO Action Pledge, looking
Yes.
at Fortune 500 companies, asking CEOs to sign on around inclusive workplace environments, around talent practices, all of this. But what they started was a public policy fellowship. So they said organizationally, we're an organization full of consultants, who have these wonderful backgrounds, highly skilled, highly educated. And there was a recognition that in the nonprofit sector, for people that were really doing public policy work, who were doing legislative action, right, kind of organizing these campaigns, you might not be able to hire in somebody who's currently making 300,000 as a consultant, right, like inside of an
Yeah.
organization. Would love to do the work, but just financially can't make it happen at this stage. And so they said, we're going to take 100 of our employees and we're going to allow them to work, like not dual job, but like actually as their job, for 6 months, for a year,
Yeah.
go work in these different organizations,
Wow.
and really make an impact. So you bring that corporate knowledge of infrastructure and all of that education and consulting experience to bear, and you drop them into an organization
Love
that
that.
could really use it. So I love that, and they opened it up for all the companies who have signed on to the CEO Action Pledge. They said, we're building the infrastructure for the assignments on the different programs, all that stuff. So we already have it. So if you want to send somebody into the program, they can kind of join this core of volunteers. And so I think that really, more so than anything else, I love that because it is certainly more than the money helps, right? And I say that
Right.
as I lead a organization, so I'm like, please keep writing us checks. Like we do need the money. The money helps, but the money only goes so far. And it really is, you need some people at the State House, you need some people involved in police reform, you need some people involved in education policy. I'm a former school board member, so what was coined as the minority achievement gap, particularly for Black boys, right?
Hmm.
The reason you aren't seeing Black men in the C-suite, right? And we're not making it out of high school, out of college, and into these types of roles, by and large, when you look at the data. So I love that program because it really is thinking about the root causes of how we ended up in these places, the social determinants of health, and how
Right.
to address them, right? The inequality at the early stages of who has a
Yeah.
Head Start program, who lives in an area with a lot of air pollution, like all these things. And so that program is targeting that. They've picked a couple of focus areas because there is so much work to do. So I lift up PwC and Chase, I think, as two examples because it touches on the talent and the internal side. It
Right.
touches on their business aspect of here's what we do, here's the service we provide, and expanding that out to really addressing these issues of racial inequality. And it also is their external philanthropic side as well. And to me, that's the trifecta of what you need in a really good DEI strategic plan.
100%. You shared so much really good information, and NWC is actually a proud CEO for Action signatory. And so I'm interested in digging in deeper to understand more about what PwC is doing in that space and how we can plug into that. But great examples, and a few other examples have been shared into the chat as well that I want to draw people's attention to. My friend Denise, glad to have you here, Denise. You have a really interesting statement that I want to give you an opportunity to voice if you're interested and willing. Would you like to come off mute and share?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. There's amazing things that have been going on for the commemoration of the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
I attended some amazing, John Hope Franklin Symposium was amazing. But what I'm a little frustrated about is the money, or the lion's share of the money, is going towards things that benefit the state and not the people. It's about economic development and tourism, and they talk about the money it'll bring into our Greenwood district. But when you look at who owns property, who is benefiting, it's done at a level that is still keeping Black people out of full engagement in the American dream. So and that's, I'm a minority that will say that as a white person, and I work in this space, and I've been in chamber leadership roles in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But white power is extremely powerful. And it's something that trying to figure out, and there's been several conversations and advisory and board meetings that I've been on, how do we lift this up? But it's almost like I would love to see an expose done on what this really means, and the fact that we are still fighting reparations.
Yeah.
The money that will be coming in from a museum that's been created will be millions. And it's very, I mean, my ears are hot right now just talking about it. So that's kind of with this. I mean, and the corporate leadership to be standing up and saying, I don't know if you guys saw the story about the American Airlines CEO on the Southwest flight.
Yeah.
I mean, that's visual, vocal, and compassionate CEO level leadership that we need to see more of. And Tulsa had that opportunity, and I didn't see one CEO leading in a visual, vocal, and a compassionate way.
Yeah. Two things that you said there that I think are really critically important that I would lift up. One is that you know, so many times these initiatives look really nice on the surface, right? Like, and it seems like, oh, that's a great idea, and I'm glad we're doing that, and that's a step forward in the right direction. But you have to look at the details. You have to click down into what's actually happening to understand it and go, well, is this actually a step in the right direction, or is this really more of the same? Is this a performative action? Is this economically driven, and who are the economics benefiting? So I love that question. Or statement that you made there, and just your example of doing the click down into what's really going on with this, right? Like where is this money going? Where, you know, who is this actually benefiting, and who is this actually for? There's that statement of nothing about us without us is for us, right? And so I think that's a really good example. I'll have to look up that museum as well and see what's happening. The other side is that it's not too late for them to do right, and so I think people go, gosh, we've missed our opportunity, and so we'll choose to sit back and do nothing. Like, oh, we should have did that in April, but since we didn't, like, we'll just keep moving forward. And so, you know, it's like you can still make the choice of what are we doing with the museum admission fees? Like, where is that going? What kind of programs are we going to support in the community? You know, would we do something that are like reparations for the descendants, right? Like, I don't know, but there's still opportunity on the table to say, you know, we can still do some things. We can still make changes to this plans so that it actually does become a model of equity, right? I've been thrilled. It's so interesting. You know, before last year, I think so many of us didn't know what Juneteenth was, right? And then all of a sudden, these companies were just giving out Juneteenth as a holiday, you know, which I have conflicting feelings about as well. And you know, we didn't know about Juneteenth. Most of us didn't know about the Greenwood district and Black Wall Street, and we didn't know that story. They were hidden stories. So I'm glad they're finally getting the attention that they deserve, and it just shows me that we still have a very long road to go in all of these things. So it's like, you know, keep the good intentions coming, but now we have to be really intentional about the actions on the other side of that. You know, and I'd be willing to bet a good number of people involved might not even be thinking about, you know, what they're doing is harmful, right? And so they need the voices like that of all of us on the call to say, let me help you actually see the real impact. And, so that at least at the end of it, you can't claim you didn't know, because you definitely knew what was going on. And here's the opportunity for us to make this better, to make it right, to make it equitable, to make it just.
No, I love that. And we're getting very close to the top of the hour. And so this is how I would like to close out today, in the spirit of all of the conversations we've had related to statements and commitments, and whether or not people have, in a really meaningful way, held up what they stated that they were intending to do. We are, of course, in the midst of Pride Month, and I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about how in which some organizations are being perceived as showing up in a performative way during this month that's causing some harm as well. And I want to read something quickly, and I just want to get you to respond to it in your own way as we close out. And maybe what, Omari, you can address is how can organizations as well as individuals make their LGBTQ plus, allyship authentic and not performative. But there was a post on LinkedIn yesterday, and I'll give credit to Jason Hudson. He's the one that posted this. And it's a post of a picture inside of a large mall. And there's lots of, rainbow colors. And here's what he says. Listen, I understand corporate appropriation of pride is annoying and highly suspect, but I also know that walking through a shopping mall screaming with rainbows makes this 37-year-old man feel seen, and I can't imagine how it would have changed my life as a 10-year-old. So I just want to hold the fact in mind that there are two perspectives on this. And while we want people to certainly make sure that they are meaningful and it's not performative, there's a balance there, and there's some gray area there. And I just want to get your perspective and your thoughts as we close out today, just around that topic. And I'm sorry that we only have a little time, but I certainly wanted to get this in.
It's okay. I'm glad. Because I think, and not even just with Pride Month, really kind of in this work. And it's everybody's kind of changing, and it's like, you add a woman to your logo for the month of March because it's Women's History Month. It's like, okay, all right. So there is a side of it that is absolutely annoying. And then there is a side of it that, like, I do feel seen. I do think it does help people who feel like they can't have the conversation, who feel like they are invisible. I've had the good privilege of living in major metropolitan areas, which by and large tend to be more progressive. But I also have had the experience through my jobs of being in what some people call the flyover states, in being small town America, right? Where there is only one Black family in town, and maybe there is only one out person, in that town as well. And just how excruciating, just thinking about like how excruciating that can be to not see anything that's like you. So to be able to go to the store and see some packaging, for Pride Month, can be the thing that opens up the conversation to help you feel seen. It's a balance, and I say for organizations, you have to make sure that the community that you are trying to speak to and represent, that community has to be at the table. They have to be involved in those decisions. Pride Month makes me think always a lot about courage. And so I'll close with this. Brene Brown in her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, defined courage as telling the story of who you are with your whole heart. And I think really a lot of what at its core, the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, justice work is really about is, are we hearing people's stories when they tell us? Are we hearing their hearts? Are we creating the spaces for people to be able to tell their stories, right? And then being able to listen with intention to what it is that they say, and be able to receive that. So I would say to all of us, have courage, my friends, courage to ask the questions and to ask people about their stories, and the courage to tell your story as well, and tell it with your whole heart. Heart touches heart. And I think there are, love is really the most powerful emotion that we have in the world. And it's really hard to turn away from love in that way. So when we tell the story of who we are, with love as our intention, people generally tend to receive it in love. And so I hope that stays true for all of us, and that we have the courage to love harder, to love more fully, to love more authentically, and be our whole selves.
That is so beautiful. And what an incredible way to end this conversation. We're so grateful for everything that you have deposited. And I know that everyone that has been able to be exposed to your words, your wisdom, your intellect, your thoughts of hope and solidarity is going to serve us all well. And so thank you for accepting our invitation. We wish you much success. And thank you all for joining us. We're so grateful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Omari.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.